Over 6 months after the last launch of Starship, SpaceX has finally flown it again. We've just seen Starship Flight 2 today at somewhere around 8 a.m., and it went a little better than the first flight. Actually, you might even say a lot better. But the ship still blew up at the end, and so did the booster in absolutely spectacular fashion. So, what happened here? We don't have any official word from SpaceX on why these explosions happened beyond it being the flight termination system going off. So all we can do is take a look at what was happening before the explosion and see what went on. But first of all, let's take a look at just overall how the flight went. So the first thing you'll notice is that this time Booster 9 took off with all 33 engines running. Booster 7 only had 30 at liftoff. They decided to launch even with 3 engines not running. And that's an improvement right there. So we've already got one thing going for Booster 9 that Booster 7 didn't have. And then as we continue looking at Booster 9's flight, you'll notice a much cleaner flame and less explosions going on the booster. All the engines just kept on working, and there didn't seem to be any violent failures like we saw on the previous orbital flight. And as we keep on moving, you'll see that Booster 9 kept going pretty smoothly all the way up and got through max Q just fine. And here's where things get really interesting: the hot staging maneuver. Hot staging isn't something unique to SpaceX. Rockets such as the Soyuz and Proton perform hot staging, and basically what they're doing is they're lighting the engine of the ship while still attached to the booster, with the booster engine still firing, to keep the propellants from drifting up through the fuel tank and basically forming all these bubbles of air in the fuel, which can happen if you're just coasting with no acceleration. So by keeping those booster engines firing, they don't have to deal with these bubbles, and they can just light the engines no problem. Now the problem here, the disadvantage here is pretty obvious. The booster is getting absolutely cooked by the ship's engines. So it needed more reinforcements in that area. So they add this hot staging ring, and all of this seemed to work pretty well. The ship engines all lit up, the booster engines shut down to just 3 to keep it moving, and it separated. Everything worked amazingly well. This was already so much better than the previous flight of Starship, where they didn't even make it staging. And everything's still controlled here, so massive progress already. Now we have the flip maneuver of the booster. And at this point, things start to get a little bit weird. You'll notice that the booster engines actually never shut down, those inner 3. They just keep going, probably to help steer the booster into the position that it will be performing the boost back burn. And then the outer 10 engines light up. And if you watch in the bottom left corner there, where it's showing how many booster engines are running, you'll notice they just start dropping like flies. I don't know what happened here. It could have something to do with the interaction of the ship's exhaust plume with the booster. That may be causing some unusual heat and pressure at the base of the booster, or it could just be this is the first time that a super heavy booster has had a chance to restart engines in flight, and there's just some weird dynamic going on in there, some cavitations or whatever that mess with the engines. And pretty soon after that, we start seeing a lot of venting going on from the engine section of the booster. That could just be gas getting spit out by the booster engines as they shut down. If we look ahead just a little bit further, the booster explodes. And if we pause there and zoom in a bit, we can see that the explosion was actually triggered by the flight termination system. I think the reason for this is pretty straightforward. The booster engines just were not working correctly. By that point, I think more than half of them had shut down. so there wasn't a chance that was going to land, and it probably wouldn't even be able to get back to the landing zone. So it was safer to just destroy it than see what happens if those engines kept running. So at this point, the booster is no longer a factor here. It's toast. It's gone. Let's take a look at the ship. The ship, it keeps on going for a while. All 6 engines were lit, and they continued to fire for the entirety of the orbital insertion burn. And all that seems to be going pretty smoothly until around 7 minutes. At that time, we start to see some venting from the ship. And I was a little bit curious here. I thought that might be due to an engine flaming out or possibly even exploding. But I took a look at the acceleration of the ship through that time period, and it never shows any signs of rapidly accelerating due to venting gas from the fuel tanks or rapidly decelerating due to engines no longer operating. The acceleration seems to be pretty consistent, so it doesn't seem to be the engines that are at fault here this time. So our alternative is that there was some sort of intentional or unintentional vent coming directly from the fuel tanks. And this is a very significant vent, more significant than I'd say we've seen from a ship before, although since it's in essentially a vacuum at this point, the vent plumes are going to be much larger as the gas expands into space. So it's really, we don't have anything to compare this to determine if this was a nominal vent or a leak in the fuel tank. But at this point, the fuel levels are pretty low, and the ship is getting fairly close to orbit. At the time when the engines apparently cut off, the ship was traveling at about 6.7 kilometers per second. For reference, orbital velocity is somewhere around 7.7. And what we saw at this point was that the indicators, which show the status of all the engines, showed all 6 engines shut down at once. An altitude of around about 150 kilometers. By this point, it actually descended from a peak altitude of 149. I'm not sure what's up with that. That's a pretty low orbit, but it doesn't have to be too high since they're only going around once. But the fuel on the ship is pretty low to make up this last kilometer per second of speed, and it's almost surprisingly low given the fact that the ship was carrying no payload. Now, because so much of your weight on the ship is fuel, that last little bit of fuel remaining, now that almost all of the weight has burned off, that last bit's going to be the most effective amount of your fuel. So maybe that would be enough to reach orbital velocity, but I tend to suspect that it wouldn't have quite gotten them there. And if the ship isn't able to reach the speed it needs to re-enter at the expected landing zone, that's a big problem, because you don't want your Starship re-entering over populated areas. Like, for instance, depending on just how much speed it was able to get, it could re-enter over Africa. That wouldn't be good. We don't want that. We want it to re-enter over the ocean. And as a matter of fact, with the first flight, the reason that Starship never separated from the booster after it started tumbling was the ship was able to automatically determine that it wouldn't have enough fuel to make it to the landing zone if it just separated and tried to make it the rest of the way out zone. So it never even tried. So that suggests that the ship would probably blow itself up if it's going to not reach the cleared, safe landing area. And as for why it didn't have enough fuel to get there, it doesn't seem to be the fault of the engines. We already determined that. And so far, the Starship tanks have proven themselves to be pretty durable. I mean, in that first flight, it tumbled for several minutes with a hole in the tanks from the flight termination system without ever falling apart. So it doesn't seem like these tanks would just break on their own. So I really have no idea what would happen there that would cause it to run out of fuel. The booster seemed to run as long as it was supposed to. So it's not like the Raptor engines were just being horribly inefficient. So we're just going to have to wait and see what SpaceX says on that one. Because we don't have any close-up views of the ship. There's really not much of a way to tell what happened there definitively. But to take a step back here, this is so much better than Starship's first flight, where we had the booster tumbling out of control, and just everything that could go wrong went wrong on that flight. The launch complex seems to be in much better shape than after the first flight. That's huge progress right there. There wasn't a dust storm like the last launch triggered, no rock tornado. All of this is the sort of stuff that the FAA would be looking at and would be concerned by. We're seeing a lot less of that. The flight termination system works. That's a huge thing for the FAA, because they showed that if things aren't going like they're supposed to, they can actually blow up the flight like it's supposed to. So depending on what exactly caused all those engine failures on the booster, and what caused the ship to just kind of stop working and explode up there, depending on what triggered all that, if it's an easy fix, which it's space flight, there aren't many easy fixes, but if it's an easy fix, then we could potentially see Starship flying again in a few months. I mean, after the nightmare of the first orbital flight, they're back in the air within a year, actually quite a bit less than a year. So I would expect to see our next Starship flight possibly in a few months, maybe in the spring of this year, but that we'll have to wait and see. And of course, I'm sure SpaceX learned a lot from this flight. There's a whole 8 minutes of data there to be gathered, and we've seen from that first launch attempt that they've definitely improved off of their findings from that first flight, so we can definitely expect this third launch to go even better than this one that we just saw. So here's hoping we get Orbital Flight 3 soon, with maybe, just maybe, a re-entry. That would be incredible to see. But until then, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of amazing footage coming out of this flight, lots of data from SpaceX, and there's lots to look forward to. Hopefully you learned a thing or two from the video, and I'll leave you with a side-by-side view of Starship Flight 1 and 2. And a quick update here. As I was editing this video, SpaceX released some photos from the launch, and they show that the heat shield of Starship lost a lot of tiles. I don't have an exact count yet, but I'll pull up a picture here and you can see for yourself that heat shield was having serious trouble there. They're going to need to work on that for the next flight.